My name is John Mackel. I'm an attorney in San Francisco and an advisor on the Real Property Law Section's Executive Committee. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Hall today. Professor Hall is the Robert and Carol McNeil Joint Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, a professor of economics. His research focuses on the overall performance of the U.S. economy, including unemployment, capital formation, financial activity, and inflation. Today he plans to focus on sorry, the type's a little small. The forces that account for the poor economic performance and the outlook for improvement, with particular emphasis on the role of the Federal Reserve in the coming year. Thank you very much, Professor Hall.
Sure. Thanks very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to talk about housing because it's a fixed rule of public speaking that you should always talk about what you know about. I know something, but housing economics is pillow talk at home because my wife has a major role in mortgage finance and other financial topics. So I picked up a little there, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Rather, with the change in command at the Federal Reserve Board, which takes place this weekend, it calls attention to the question of what the capabilities of monetary policy are, what the remaining problems, which are, I think, pretty severe in the U.S. economy, and then looking a little bit into the future. In particular, I'll end by talking about what aspects of the weak performance of the U.S. economy could be within the reach of monetary policy, and which ones will either cure themselves or call for some other type of intervention not under the control of the Federal Reserve. So we all know that the problems of the U.S. economy began sometime in 2007, 2008, but in particular the financial crisis that broke out in mid-September of 2008 is unquestionably a point where disaster really struck. Things had slowed down. The economy had reached its peak of activity at the end of 2007. There were many warning signs, especially a lot of talk then about what the role of real estate and declining house prices and the ramifications of that. But nobody really thought just what a tremendous adverse shock the events of September 2008 would be. During that time at home, we had a Post-it on the refrigerator, which calculated, at that time there was a lot of interest in subprime, and it calculated the total subprime book and what would happen to financial institutions if there were a large decline in the value of that, say a 50% decline, and it seemed like nothing. It seemed like a shock that should not cause the economy to go into a total tailspin. If you compared that shock to the shock of 2000, 2001, when the stock market reached its peak in March of 2000 and then declined very substantially, and even more so after 9/11, that shock was trillions of dollars, and the Post-it on the refrigerator said, no more than $250 billion. It was very small compared to the seeming financial shock earlier. And yet, it and the other things that went with it turned out to have just a huge hammering effect on the U.S. economy. Well, a large amount of analysis has taken place, and other Post-its have been on the refrigerator with much larger numbers since then. And we really learned a lesson. A macroeconomist and a financial economist talking about this subject at dinner every night didn't get it right at all. And I think it's fair to say that we just couldn't imagine that it would be like that. And almost all specialists were in the same boat. Okay, so what happened? Let me talk now about some of the things that happened that enable us to understand more fully just what the nature of this adverse event was. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, a lot of the events go through the household. So some of them relating to household dealings in real estate, others implications of the fact that there was a financial squeeze on the household. So let me start with this, which is the ratio of consumption to disposable income. Consumption is about 2/3 of GDP. If consumption falls, the economy is always in trouble. Consumption rarely falls. In fact, in most recessions, it stays about steady. So what happened here, this big decline of consumption that you can see mapped out here, not only did consumption fall, I mean, after all, income was falling for other reasons, but consumption fell relative to income. In other words, saving, which had been negative, turned positive at this point. Households were squeezed into saving more by what happened in financial institutions. And also, I think there's a fair amount of evidence that there was some panic in households in the direction of spending less, in particular spending less on durable goods. So, for example, the sales of cars fell from about the normal 16 million a year to about 10 million at the trough. And that by itself was a big source of distress in the economy. So one thing we learn is that the consumer was in the forefront, bore the brunt of what was happening in financial institutions. And one way of seeing that is to look at household liabilities, the total amount that the household sector owed to financial institutions. That had been rising rapidly. If you go back to earlier years, this had been a big trend starting during the low interest rate period after the recession of 2001. And households borrowed a great deal. That was the period of subprime excess. It was the period of home equity loan expansion. It was also a big expansion of credit card debt. This looks at all the liabilities, all the debts of the household, adjusted for inflation. Now, during this period, inflation wasn't very high, but it's still a good idea to put it in purchasing power terms. Well, you can see that it reached a maximum right before the crisis hit, and then the crisis resulted in a very substantial decline. Now, the decline took two forms, and there's been a lot of debate about this, but it took two forms. One is that households were squeezed by lenders and actually repaid and owed less as a result of repaying. The other part of it, there were very substantial defaults. So the decline here is a combination of two. Now, in terms of what happens to the household, those two cases are very different. If a household repays, the cash has to come from consumption. The only other source of available cash, assuming that the income remains the same, relatively few people during this time were able to go out and work harder. The total amount of work effort was declining, so they were essentially cutting back consumption, especially purchases of durables during this period. On the other hand, defaults don't generate any similar effect. They have other consequences for households, but a default, which results in simply not repaying, means a decline in what's owed without any squeeze on consumption. So I and other people have done some work, shown in this slide, of trying to divide those two into their two parts. Find out just how much of a squeeze there was on the household sector as a result of the fact that financial institutions, which had been, so if you look at the horizontal line here, that's zero. That's where the amount of cash coming from households to financial institutions to pay interest and to repay debts. At zero, it would say that people were borrowing exactly enough to not only roll their debt, but also to pay interest on the debt. So that basically divides the household sector between a Ponzi game below the horizontal line in the earlier years from 2000 to 2006. Households were playing a Ponzi game. That is, they were able to get enough cash, new cash, out of financial institutions to actually consume more. And this is a period of negative saving and consumption funded by, for example, taking larger balances on HELOCs there was a huge refinancing boom during this period as well, of course. All the events that are pretty well documented, but this turns it into a single number, and that is how much extra consumption was funded by financial institutions lending more than they were receiving in interest and repayments. Then, very dramatically, starting in 2007 and then rising more after the crisis, the situation reversed. The squeeze on the household was just tremendous. Notice that the vertical axis here is the percent of consumption. So during the Ponzi game period, there were times when almost 10% of consumption was being funded, not by work effort, but by borrowing. And that changed sign and then got up into the 7, 8, 9%. So there was something like a 15 percentage point swing in this number. Well, no wonder consumption fell. So this was just a tremendous squeeze on the economy. And I think directly traceable to the events that led up to, especially real estate events, which had a tremendous effect in the mortgage market. But also some of the squeeze came in other types of lending. The standards for lending for car loans, for example, were dramatically tightened during this period. Now, there's an exciting new thing that Google makes possible. You can find out what people are thinking by tabulating their queries. And this has become a high art. And of course, one of the high arts here is to figure out the very best search term. And I tried out a bunch, and I had family members competing to find the best one, but I think I won. This is one that I came up with. And that is searches for withdrawal penalty. So you can go back basically to around the time when Google went public in 2004 to measure this, and it's a very useful tool. Well, it shows something. With searching for withdrawal penalty is almost certainly a sign of some kind of financial distress. It means that somebody made some kind of a commitment, such as buying a long-term CD, or even more likely, putting money into a retirement fund, and then, subject to whatever the rules are, being willing to potentially, or at least thinking about paying a penalty for a withdrawal. That's surely a sign of financial distress, and you can see it tracks the chronology perfectly. It reached its maximum in 2008, 2009. It's a little worrisome, and I don't have an explanation for this. Generally, things have gotten better since then, but there was this upward blip recently, in the past year, in searches for withdrawal penalties, which doesn't show up in other measures of household financial stress. Okay, so that's, so that basically tells you, I think, the single most important thing. I can just tick off other things that happened. There was a collapse of plant and equipment investment. Some of that was the result of the interference with the proper operation of the financial system. One of the interesting things we learned, though, in 2001 is that we have an extremely robust financial system with respect to, particularly to funding investment. There wasn't any similar collapse of investment then, even though there was a big financial shock. And it's simply because many big companies, and this is especially true in this area, are not dependent on credit at all for financing investment. It's just not a factor in their life. Companies like Apple notoriously carry a large amount of liquidity on their balance sheets. At any time that they thought they had a good investment opportunity, they would have no trouble funding it from their own balance sheet. There's just no, I mean, the only role that a bank has in a company like Apple is to, cash checks. It's just not an important relationship. And that's generally true in many sectors. Certainly all high-tech sectors have that feature. There's very little leverage in U.S. business outside of a few sectors like transportation. All right, so that was a factor that led to, but there are, of course, other bank-dependent firms, smaller firms in particular, were definitely squeezed by tightening of credit, and that resulted in a decline in their investment, which is an important part of investment. And of course, investment in real estate, especially residential real estate, collapsed completely. That was one of the most remarkable declines in any sector, 50% decline in expenditures for residential construction between 2006 and its trough in about 2010. Okay, so we had a problem of weak spending. Now, weak spending is normally not a problem because of the role of monetary policy. So in a normally functioning economy, we don't have an issue with respect to if people want to spend less on something, it's no problem because we have a feedback mechanism that historically, in recent decades, has just worked superbly, which is we lower the interest rate. The interest rate is a signal about whether you should spend now or spend later. When interest rates are low, the time to spend is now. So we can accelerate spending and get both businesses and households to spend more by cutting interest rates. It's infallible. It's just worked perfectly over and over. And if you look at the chronology of the U.S. economy and compare interest rates and recessions, every time there's a recession, you see, in fact, more and more aggressively, the Fed has cut interest rates. And that has stimulated spending, and recessions since the recession of 1981-82 have been quite mild as a result. So we have a feedback mechanism. It's like having a thermostat in your house. It doesn't matter how warm or cold it is outside within a reasonable range, your temperature in your house is always the same because the thermostat works its magic. So the Federal Reserve was the economy's thermostat. It would adjust the interest rate as necessary to stabilize spending, and it worked beautifully. Until something happened, which is that it can't drive interest rates below zero. It just can't be done. If you want to ask why it can't be done, it's actually a little subtle. I mean, we know it can't be done, but the reason it can't be done is that at negative interest rates, there's one asset that always pays zero, and that's cash, folding cash, greenbacks. Not financial instruments, but actual cash. If we tried to set interest rates negative, deeply negative, more than maybe minus 1%, hedge funds and others would exercise their right to accumulate very large amounts of cash, presumably in secure storage, and they would earn zero when everyone else was earning -1. Well, I mean, that's coining money. That's what hedge funds love to do. And they would do it, and it would basically prevent interest rates from falling that low. So we have this, what economists now call a zero lower bound, is a fundamental restriction on what the Federal Reserve can do. And it's still very much in place. The Fed has been struggling over and over, and I think not terribly effectively, but certainly with a good heart, to try to overcome that problem by using other tools at its disposal, but they haven't been very effective. If only we could get a nice low interest rate. Or there is a substitute for a low interest rate that sends the same signal to the consumer, and that's inflation. If we could gin up some inflation, that would send the same signal. It would say, well, goods are getting more expensive, buy goods now rather than later. Or as the economists would put it, it would enable us to have a negative real interest rate, even though the nominal interest rate can't go below zero. So, well, that makes it sound simple. Why doesn't the Fed just push hard to generate inflation? Now, a lot of alarmists have thought that all the things that the Fed has done, having a $3 or $4 trillion balance sheet would cause inflation, but it hasn't. Ben Bernanke would have given up something valuable, his MIT PhD, if for 1% more inflation. Inflation has been running significantly below target, and that's exacerbated the problem. If only monetary policy could figure out some way to generate more inflation, we would get more spending. But it has not succeeded in doing that. When we came into this, inflation was anchored in the 1% to 3% per year range. We'd gone 20 years, mostly under Greenspan, with very successful stabilization of inflation at a target that a lot of economists agreed to, 1 to 3%. And we thought, although this has never been completely compelling proposition, that slack in the economy tends to moderate inflation. But actually, when you look carefully at that, it moderates it just when the slack starts, but once you get into a more stagnant situation, as we've had recently, inflation tends to just remain. So we've had inflation running at the 1% level instead of the target of 2% for quite a while now on the average. So we're somewhat below target, but it's not getting worse. The counterpart of that is it's hard to get inflation up, just like it's hard for inflation to go down. In the Great Depression, by contrast, we had rampant deflation, very high real interest rates, complete collapse of the economy. But fortunately, I mean, some of us worried in March of 2009 that we were headed in the same direction. But no, didn't happen. And we're very lucky that it didn't happen. So there's a great difference, and it entirely has to do with the behavior of inflation. So if you look at different measures of inflation, the Fed likes the red line here, as you can see, is a much more stable measure. It's a measure that is which get rid of the things that fluctuate the most, food and fuel, and then the blue line is just the regular consumer price index. But you can see they're both sending the same signal in the last couple of years, and that is slightly downward. So not worrisomely so far, but there has been concern. Not so much today, but 6 months ago there was more concern that this was headed in a deflationary, not an inflationary direction. So a lot of measures of prospective inflation agree with that. It doesn't look like we're headed for inflation, even though some inflation right now would be good. Obviously, we don't want inflation to get out of control, but some inflation now would be very helpful. If you look at wage inflation, the situation is grimmer. There's an argument that the Federal Reserve ought to be thinking at least as much about wage inflation as it does about price inflation. I don't think that's been people like me have advocated that, but it's still an ivory tower concept. The inflation to most people means the cost of living. So, but you can see that wage inflation, the reasonable target for wage inflation would be about 3% a year, and we're not close to that. And again, it's headed downward, not upward. So that's another danger signal. Okay, so yeah, we're doing fine. All right, so the last topic I wanted to talk about is of the things that are wrong with the economy today, what ones could be responsive to monetary policy, or for that matter, fiscal policy. Fiscal policies cannot occur as things are configured currently in Washington because of the split government. No fiscal program will get the support of both Republicans and Democrats that in terms of something that would actually expand the economy. So we're back to monetary policy. So what can Janet Yellen do? Well, there's a good argument that the remaining unemployment, which is not that high, 6.7% by historical standards, is not that high. The historical average is 5.8%, so we're now within 1 percentage point. But monetary expansion conceivably can attack unemployment and get it back down to its normal level, say 5.8%. Hours of work in the economy have mostly recovered. So work schedules are now within an hour of where they are at normal times. They had dropped several hours below. And that's another sort of demand responsive, monetary policy responsive thing. But if you look at all the other reasons why GDP is well below its previous growth track, they appear to be things that monetary policy probably can't touch. For example, of the 12 percentage points that GDP is below its growth track that we thought it was on back in 2007, productivity accounts for about a quarter of the total. So that's the upper right-hand segment of the pie chart. And nobody, to my knowledge, thinks that monetary policy has a handle on productivity. We've had a decline in productivity growth. It's hard to explain, but I think it's something we have to live with. It's a problem of the economy that we need other tools to deal with. We have had a huge shortfall in capital formation, plant and equipment. We're about 9 percentage points behind where we would have been in terms of the capital stock, the business capital stock. And again, that's not something that monetary policy, in the longer run, monetary policy might be able to do something, but in the short run, that we just can't change it. We can, at best, we can get investment back to where it belongs. So that's another quarter. Interestingly, we've had quite a decline in the birth rate during this period. Bearing children is another form of investment, and investment has generally, all investment type decisions, people have been scared off them. And there's also, interestingly, a small increase in the death rate during this period, which seems definitely coincided in terms of timing. The only relief is that there's been a substantial increase in immigration, interestingly. So the rest of the world thinks that the U.S. is still a good place, but the decline in the birth rate swamped that, and we're actually 1.1% behind in terms of population. So that maps directly into labor force and output. And finally, we've seen a dramatic withdrawal from work in the U.S. economy. It's not totally new, but it definitely coincided, started around 2007 in its most aggressive form. But here's a number, just in case you think this is a small thing. In 2000, not so long ago, 50% of teenagers on the average over the year worked. Part-time, full-time, mostly part-time. Today, only 25% of teenagers work. We virtually eliminated teenage employment, which is not a good thing. And employment and participation in the labor force has declined among young people in general. There's been some decline among older people. We have what we call a labor force participation crisis in the U.S. that's gotten lots of attention, but I don't think, and certainly my reading of the evidence is that monetary policy can touch that. We have some very important questions about how we tax lower income workers that desperately need attention, because that seems to be the main issue, but it's not a monetary policy issue. So don't think that we're going to get out of this through monetary policy. I think mostly we're going to get out of it through time and maybe some good luck. We'll certainly should get back on track in terms of investment. Productivity growth, it's always guesswork what productivity growth will be. But I think the one area where policy is going to have to think carefully about is this withdrawal from work, which is approaching a crisis. The U.S. is looking more and more like Europe, where a shockingly small fraction of adults take part in the labor force, where many young people don't start work until they're 35. That's the direction we're moving, and it doesn't seem to be a good direction. We need to reverse that. All right, so let me stop there and throw it open for questions.
So you mentioned that the Fed's trying to increase investment, but you also said that the Fed is trying to encourage people to spend. So if they're spending, that means they're not saving, which actually discourages investment. So what's the deal?
Okay. Well, the rest of the world has been very kind to us in dealing with that issue. During the time when we had lots of investment and negative saving, we sailed right through because that generated a capital inflow to the U.S., which was a very healthy development. So many other parts of the world, especially China, feel they're deficient in investment opportunities, but generate lots of saving. So it's the exact flip side of the U.S. So we have this very healthy relationship with China in which China funds our investment at very low cost to us, so that we could simultaneously have more spending and more investment. The two are not locked to each other because of the fact that we live in a global economy which is very happy to invest in the U.S.
But if they're
We've been puzzling over that because, of course, this has been going on for a long time. The answer turns out to be that we borrow from the rest of the world at shockingly low rates. We invest in the rest of the world as essentially venture capitalists and make very high returns. So simultaneously, we can get all this cheap finance and use it productively here and at the same time invest productively in the rest of the world. It's magic. It shows the strength of the U.S. system. Our economy has taken a lot of knocks, but it's still the best economy. We still have the highest level of per capita income of any large advanced country. And we're doing very well in spite of the fact that we are dependent on other countries, especially China, for finance. But the whole system works. It's great. I guess we need to get to a mic.
Phone for you.
We're hearing a lot of emphasis on income inequality and trying to narrow that gap. What about the tax gap, where the very small minority is paying the huge majority of the taxes? To what extent would narrowing that gap in some way improve the economy?
Okay. We recognize that there's a trade-off between efficiency, that is, getting people to face the full incentives to produce a lot of stuff and have good ideas and build new businesses. So for that, we basically would like very low tax rates. On the other hand, most of us, I think, feel that there is an obligation of the government to overtax high-income people and use it to provide benefits to low-income people, the redistribution. The amount of that, though, is very much up for grabs. If you look across countries, it's just completely clear that the right thing to do for a country like the history of Singapore is very clear on this. Run a pretty much a low-tax, high-incentive, and make everybody better off. And then when you've gotten finally up to very high levels of income, as they have, then you can turn to equity issues. Basically, it seems like you should forget equity until you're rich. Then you should start redistributing. But of course, we're there now. So we face this issue. It's an issue that democracy has to deal with. I thought we made great advances under President Reagan when we simplified the tax system, got rid of a lot of loopholes, equalized tax rates. We didn't push tax rates to zero, but we got them lower. I thought that was the right direction to move. I was a big supporter of that. But we slipped a lot since then. We still have some pretty good features of the system. It's not the worst system by far. Always keep that in mind. But time has come, I believe, for rethinking. But the main thing I would say at this point is that we need to recognize how perverse the programs we've created to help the poor, because they tax the poor at outrageous tax rates. If you ask who's most heavily taxed in this economy, it's not somebody who's making millions of dollars a year. It's somebody who is living on $5,000 of earnings and food stamps and other forms of welfare, which all have very high tax rates. That's the first thing we need to change. We need to bring the low tax philosophy to everybody in the economy and not just apply it to the
Professor
rich.
Hall, we have one more question from Mr. Corey.
Sure.
This could be the last question.
Yes, got it.
Kind of based on the concept of getting out of this, what do you see as the potential for an acceleration in the rate of productivity growth based on technology and sort of the concept of Moore's Law?
Well, that's a very hot topic. My classmate Robert Gordon has been made a small fortune being Mr. Doom on that subject. I don't agree. I think that the benefits of modern IT, especially the benefits of databases, which have transformed transformed retail. The difference between the performance of retail today and 25 years ago is just amazing. I mean, Walmart has a server farm in Bentonville, Arkansas, of all places, which knows everything that's on every shelf in every store and sort of keeps it working. I mean, it's a miracle. And we're just scratching the surface of that. So in principle, there's just a whole lot more advances to come. But as a practical matter, we've slowed down. Over the last decade, productivity growth was very disappointing compared to the previous decade. And we don't know why. I've recently been doing research on that and haven't gone very far. We don't know why, and therefore we're not very, for the moment, Gordon's right, but it's based on 5 years of data. The next 5 years could be a lot better. We're certainly hoping for that. But forecasting productivity growth has been a complete failure at all times. So luckily productivity growth nonetheless has averaged 2% a year for the last century. So that gives us some hope that it'll keep up.
I'd like to thank Professor Hall for his time. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you.